Hey, thanks for joining us here on Saturday morning on Power Talk Radio, 1460 and 101 FM. We're going to talk technology with Luis Alvarez, CEO of the Alvarez Technology Group. On the web, alvareztg.com. At AlvarezTG is their Twitter handle. Good morning, Luis.
Good morning, Mark. How are you today?
Doing really well. So the big news on Thursday, the FCC voted along party lines 3-2 to impose what is called net neutrality. Now, the vote was 3 Democrats for it, 2 Republicans against it, and it is not going to take an effect for about another 5 or 6 months. Once it is scheduled to go into effect, that's when the lawsuits are going to come forward, and we know that Verizon and Comcast and Time Warner, the big ISPs, are planning on, internet providers, they are planning on filing lawsuit against this. And Lewis, I think that maybe some consumer rights organizations may join in the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They may file against this. The Cato Institute, a number of other, for example, libertarian organizations are going to probably join in amicus briefs on this as well. And the CEI, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, will probably file a lawsuit as well.
This is really an interesting lawsuit because it pits a bunch of different advocates that normally don't get together against the industry, quite frankly. And the idea behind it, for those that don't know, is that net neutrality essentially provides that every person on the internet is treated equally. That is, the people that own the pipes that we use, the Comcast, the Verizons, the Time Warners of the world, can't dictate who gets better performance than somebody else. And they can't charge more to get that better performance. So the idea is that the internet is a democratic, ultimately equal place that everybody should have access to equally. On the other side, people like Comcast and Verizon say, hey, look, we have certain bandwidth hogs, in particular, all the streaming video that's out there that's forcing us to upgrade our networks and invest a lot of money. And if we're not going to get any more money to do that, then that's going to stifle innovation. It's going to stifle growth and potentially cause the internet to not be as good as it could be if we can't charge more for some of these premium services that some users want to have.
But Luis, why do you need 330 pages to basically say if you're a big ISP, you can't throttle or give preference to other services? Why? If that was all that net neutrality was supposed to be, couldn't you do that in just a paragraph?
You would think. Fortunately, you and I don't make the laws. The people that make the laws are bureaucrats, and bureaucrats love to create a lot of words to say something that's pretty simple to say at the end of the day.
But here's where I don't trust this move by the commission. It's a 330-page document. They didn't allow anyone to read it before they voted on it. Before the FCC does a rulemaking, why wouldn't you want that document out in front where everybody could read what all the details are inside of it before you vote on it and put it into effect? Now, this is very much like when the Affordable Care Act was passed a few years ago. They didn't allow anyone to see it. I think they brought out one copy of it. I don't know if you remember how the vote on that went, but there was one copy of the bill, this 3,000-page bill, that was released at midnight on the day, and it was passed, I think, like on a Friday night on Christmas Eve. And the only copy that anyone in Congress or their staffs could look at was released at 12 a.m. on the morning that the vote was going to take place later that night, like about 20 hours later, like around 8 o'clock that night, the vote was going to take place. That was their idea of transparency and openness. And normally when the FCC has anything important that they're going to rule on, all the rulemaking is open for people to look at and comment on. Right? In fact, we get memos all the time from lawyers that represent radio stations, FCC rulemaking proposed on such and such type of thing. And everything is out there. The proposed rulemaking, you can go online and read it, and you can file your comments, and you have a certain amount, like 75 days or 90 days for comments to be taken. They didn't do any of that. Now, they did take comments from people.
They did do that.
But we weren't commenting on what the proposed rulemaking was. We were just commenting on the concept of what they wanted to do, but we didn't have any of the specifics of what they were going to do exactly. And so I just don't trust them. I think that once we open up this 330-page document, we're going to learn that there are going to be content controls in there.
Yeah, and according to the FCC, even though this rule, and what they basically did was that they ruled that the internet was a public utility, and that means that as a public utility, the FCC has the authority to make rules against against it. Now, the only thing they say they want to do is make a rule that, like you and I talked about, that proposes that the internet can't be throttled in any way, or extra charges be made against people to use the internet in one way or another. But the reality is, once it declared it a public utility, it's subject to any rules the FCC wants to apply. Mm-hmm. So they may say now, okay, well, we don't want to do anything other than just net neutrality, but that's a Pandora's box. Once you open it, you don't know where you're going to go.
Well, exactly. Now, here's an interesting comment. Gordon Kravitz in the Wall Street Journal wrote yesterday about this, and he was basing it upon a claim or a statement by FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai, who was one of two Republicans who voted against net neutrality. But what Gordon Kravitz wrote in the Journal yesterday was, with net neutrality, bureaucrats can review the fairness of Google's search results, Facebook's news feeds, and the news sites' links to one another and to advertisers. BlackBerry is already lobbying the FCC to force Apple and Netflix to offer apps for BlackBerry's unpopular phones. Bureaucrats will oversee peering, content delivery networks, and other parts of the interconnected network that enables everything from Netflix and YouTube to security drones and online surgery. Wow.
Yeah, if we draw the worst case picture, it's ugly. But the reality is, first off, that these rules don't go into effect for several months, and they're likely going to be litigated for a while before anything happens. And by then you'll have a new presidential election, you have new congressional elections. Who knows what will happen between now and then. I think, though, that what this proves, interestingly enough, if you take away the politics, is the power of the public. Because the whole idea of net neutrality was something that was kind of inside the beltway for a long time, where you had powerful interests lobbying against any sort of net neutrality rulings. And for a while there, it looked like the FCC originally was just going to side with the folks that basically have all the money, which is, okay, well, they can set minimums and maximums, and they can charge extra for access. But it became this cause celeb, if you will, and many public advocates went online and started advocating and started creating so much noise that the FCC had to back off and say, okay, well, we are going to open this up for public comment and get folks to give us feedback and look at the results. So I think in a way it's a victory for the people, but it's one of those things that be careful what you wish for, because we don't know what the end result is going to be.
Right. Well, I still go back to 330 pages that we weren't allowed to see. To me, the devil's in the details, and it's one of those kinds of things like one congresswoman said a few years ago, we have to pass the bill before we can read it and find out what's in it. They know what's in it, and once we find out what's in it, a lot of people aren't going to be very happy. Now, that is if it all goes into effect. As we mentioned, there are lawsuits that are going to be coming forward, and the way it works is that you can't file a lawsuit against something until it actually goes into effect and becomes law. So the lawsuits won't be filed until like 1 minute after the rulemaking takes effect. And I think one of the things that's going to be contended by those filing the lawsuit is, look, the internet is not a traditional utility like the telephone system is. And Verizon, in making their point with a news release yesterday, I don't know if you heard about this, but they typed out their news release on a 1934 typewriter, and they sent that out.
Yeah.
And that was making their point that the FCC rulemaking was based upon antiquated ideas in the heads of the commissioners that voted for it. Now, the other interesting thing from this, Louis, Rick Santorum, a former Pennsylvania senator and presidential candidate, he made an interesting comment on Sean Hannity's show yesterday, and he said, well, the silver lining on this for people who don't like it is this is not legislation, it is a rulemaking. And what that means is that it is much easier to overturn rulemakings than legislation. It is very difficult to unwind legislation that's passed by Congress, but an agency rulemaking can be changed by a new commissioner, a new majority of commissioners, or even a new president, because the president appoints the commissioners. And the way the five-member FCC commission works is that the party in power that has the presidency has 3 appointments to the commission, and the party out of power has 2. So it's always that 3-2 simple majority that exists there. So say you have a Republican president elected in 2016, he'll put 3 votes on the commission, and you can bet that one of the acid test questions for those candidates is going to be net neutrality. If I put you on the commission, you're going to overturn it, right? And if they all answer yes, then they're on. And if they answer no, then next candidate. Yeah. So this thing could be overturned. Well, first off, it could be overturned by the courts. It could end up in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will either rule that it is a proper use of rulemaking by the commission or it's improper, and they'll invalidate it or they'll validate it. And it could also be overturned by a new president. So it's not necessarily a done deal forever.
No, and the reality is that, as you pointed out, the rules that the FCC passed are now going to be scrutinized by the public as well as by the interests that want to overturn it. Mm-hmm. So once you know what's there, it may not be as popular as the thing that was in everybody's head when nobody knew what it was.
Right.
So it may die a death of its own, or conversely, there may be elements of it that Congress will take up and say, okay, well, we're going to legislate certain things and come to some sort of consensus on both sides of the aisle on the way that the internet, at least in the U.S., because that's the other thing you got to keep in mind. I mean, this is essentially just a U.S. law, and the internet is global, so it only affects and impacts U.S. companies. Any other carrier around the world can do whatever the heck it wants because it's not subject to U.S. laws.
One of the interesting things I saw, somebody made a comment on a bulletin board yesterday that, and now this is wholly, since we haven't seen the rulemaking, we don't know what it is exactly, but they said that they had heard that there was something along the lines in their rulemaking that said that the operators of message boards, bulletin boards like news sites and other people have, they're going to be responsible for any untruths and activities, comments by users of those sites.
Yeah, actually, I had read that as well, and I did a little investigation, and as far as we can tell, that's false. That's just some kind of a scary story that people put out there to try to make the FCC ruling worse than it is. But it's not going to regulate any content or regulate or require that the hosts of that content in any way censor or are liable for the negative things that are being said. Now, having said that you bring up a really good point. Something that Congress is actually debating. The Republicans in Congress right now are taking up a mantle that they feel that social media organizations like Facebook and Yahoo and Google should be actively censoring terrorist sites, known terrorist postings and Facebook pages and places like where ISIS recruits. They feel that, Facebook should take those sites down, and if not, then Facebook should have some liability for the actions of those organizations. So this is a real muddy, slippery terrain that we're entering into because you have people on both sides of the aisle that are arguing for some level of censorship. And, as much as you and I detest terrorist organizations, ISIS and those, Al-Qaeda and those folks, the reality is that, freedom of speech is freedom of speech. If you want to start censoring, who's going to make those decisions?
I think here's the thing. Until we get to when the law is implemented or the rules are implemented, I don't want to call them laws because laws are different. Laws are made by legislatures. Rules are implemented by agencies. But until the rulemaking is put into effect and we see what happens with the lawsuits and the courts weigh in, let's everybody keep their shirt on. That's all I'm going to say.
Exactly.
All right. Been talking with Luis Alvarez, CEO of the Alvarez Technology Group, alvareztg.com on the web. @AlvarezTG is their Twitter handle. And Luis, the toll-free number for the I-Team.
Give us a call at 866-78-I-TEAM. That's 866-784-8326.
Thank you, Luis.
Take care, Mark.
Thank you, Luis.
Take care, Mark.
Thank you, Luis.